Ambassador Samuel Moncada is still with us from Caracas and will be joined in a minute by Emilio Cardenas, who was Argentina's ambassador to the United Nations, and by Pablo Navarrete, who is a documentary filmmaker and who met Chávez. Ambassador Moncada, the charge against Chávez is you should be a much richer country, but he's made a mess of it that, for example, a third of your oil export money is used to pay off the debt to the Chinese. It's economic lunacy.
Okay, thank you very much for that question, because one of the facts that most people ignore, can you hear me? Let's see if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. One of the facts that most people, one of the facts that most people ignore is that the 20 years previous to Chávez's government, the Venezuelan economy fell for almost 20%. And that's what explains Chávez's victory in 1998. Even though with all the oil and money that we had previously, the Venezuelan society impoverished itself to ridiculous levels. With Chávez, we have reverted that tendency, and that's why you can see millions of people voting for Chávez for more than 15 elections. So it's ridiculous to say that the country is in shambles, when the real shambles, we had it before Chávez.
Okay, Ambassador, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us from Caracas. Let's go over to Buenos Aires now and Emilio Cardenas. Senor Cardenas, can you explain to me how you think the country has performed under Chávez, when we have heard that what he did was he took a country where there were huge discrepancies between rich and poor, and he allowed a degree of social justice?
Well, my major concern with these 14 years under Hugo Chávez that Venezuela has gone through has to do with the deterioration of democracy. Under Chávez, the checks and balances of democracy have virtually disappeared. The legislative body is just rubber stamping what the executive power says. The judiciary is not independent any longer, and there's a major concentration of power in the hands of the executive. In addition to that, Venezuela has lost some of their fundamental freedoms.
But would you accept, we'll come on to that in greater detail in a second, but would you accept, in terms of the economy, that he has tried to redistribute wealth to some of the poorest people in his country? And that's why so many of them turned out today. They think he's got a grip on the economy, the right grip.
Are you asking me about the situation of the Venezuelan economy now?
Yes.
Well, I think that the economy is going through a major difficulty. They have just, as you know, devalued. They have a very high inflation. And there are all kinds of price distortions caused by the subsidies. If Maduro is re-elected, that is not going to change at all. If the opposition instead makes it to the government in the forthcoming elections, then the Venezuelan economy may begin to be rebuilt. But at this time, the people of Venezuela, after the devaluation, have relatively lost a lot of their standard of living, particularly compared with their neighbors. So the economy of Venezuela is far from being in an ideal situation.
Let me bring in Pablo Navarrete.
You know,
I mean, it's far from an ideal situation. We see runaway inflation. There's a lot of money that could have been spent on building up the infrastructure, which simply hasn't been done.
I think when talking about Venezuela, it's essential to have a sense of historical perspective. We talk about inflation. Inflation averaged close to 55% in the 10 years preceding Chávez taking the presidency. It's actually lower now than it was before. There's been massive investments in infrastructure. There were 250,000 houses built last year. Growth last year was 5.6%. And I think someone mentioned that there has been mass social investment, and this is the reason why millions of Venezuelans are voting for Chávez. If the scenario was this doomsday scenario that's being presented by other speakers would be completely counterintuitive for Venezuelans to be voting for Chávez.
But for example, Venezuela's oil production has dropped by 25% since 2001, and there's been a booming oil price. It's not actually been a well-run economy, has it?
But oil production, it's part of a cartel, so as part of an OPEC cartel, sometimes oil production has to decrease in order for the price to remain high.
And what about the debts? I mean, 45 billion or so of debts to the Chinese, which is taking up 1/3 of oil exports just to service. I mean, that's nuts.
Well, I mean, with the Chinese, I know that the government has signed a number of agreements, close to 300 agreements. There's been last year, there was one signed for 40 billion worth of investment. I think it was diversifying its economy away from the US, and I think this is to the benefit of Venezuelan people.
Let me bring in Emilio Cardenas again. Ambassador Cardenas, do you accept that he was elected several times fairly? International observers said these were fair elections, so even though there were problems with the press and some of the anti-democratic pressures you talked about, fundamentally he was the legitimate ruler of his country.
I can hardly hear you, my friend. I mean, the microphones and the earphones are not working well.
Okay. Do you accept that he was elected several times fairly, and in that sense, he was a Democrat?
Well, to be a Democrat, you need more than being elected by normal elections. You need to respect the values of democracy, and you need to uphold by the Constitution, respecting the working of the institutions. So I think that one thing is to look democratic, and a very different thing is to be democratic. I think that Venezuela has now a chance to recover democracy. We will see whether the opposition can grab that chance. Alternatively, they will stay in a situation where they may look democratic, as I said, but that the working of the democracy is far from a normal work of a democracy.
Right, and just a final thought, Mr. Navarrete, on that. I mean, isn't that the point, that he may have done certain things for social justice, as you say, but he did them by being an autocrat, not by being a Democrat?
Well, I find it a strange autocrat that has had 15 elections in 14 years, where he's won 3 presidential elections with resounding victories. So I think we have to be careful.
He closed down the opposition, some opposition press people. He put people in jail without due process of law. I mean, these are not the actions of a Democrat, aren't they?
Again, my understanding of these cases is probably different to yours. We don't have time to go into them, but with regards to the private media, we can't forget that they essentially played an instrumental role in the coup against the US-supported coup against him. So, you know, they were regulated in a way that they would have been regulated in Britain.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you.